this semester we're focusing on both alumni and faculty. So today we have one of Tufts' own professors, Dr. Melissa McCracken. She is an assistant professor of international policy at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. And there she directs the Share Water Lab, and also she co-directs the Center for International Environment and Resource Policy, also known as SERP. Her research is not only absolutely fascinating, but also extremely important. She works on water policy and management cooperation conflicts between countries that share bodies of water, which undoubtedly is already a very important issue, but will become even more important as the impacts of climate change become more evident. She has a PhD in geography from Oregon State University, an MS in water security and international development from the University of East Anglia, and a BS in general engineering from Cal Poly San Luis Obispo. And today she's here to talk a little bit about her research. Please welcome Dr. McCracken.
All right, is this working? Everyone can hear? Cool. Well, thank you all for the invitation. It's lovely to come speak and get more people excited about water. It's not something we often think about or talk about, especially if you've grown up in a country like the United States, where you can just turn a tap and it's there, and you've got it in multiple rooms of your houses, outside of your houses. And so it's something we often take very much for granted. It's hidden and invisible resource. So super excited that you all could join me today. I was asked to share a little bit of a story about how I got into water, because as I mentioned, it's hard to sometimes experience in your day-to-day life. And that was very much the case for me growing up. It wasn't something I really thought about, even though I grew up in a very dry place in Southern California. And so I started doing my undergrad in engineering, and I realized I didn't like engineering. I don't know if I'm supposed to say that, but it wasn't for me. But I really enjoyed some of my geography classes and looking at this really interesting challenge of how do we think about creating solutions for problems in the environment that relate to people? Because there's so much that we have to interact between humans and the environment and space. And so we really need to think about them holistically, both the space, the physical aspects, and then the human aspects as well. So I moved to England and I started my undergraduate or my master's degree in environment and development, and I took a class on water security as an elective. And within 2 weeks of taking that class, I changed my major. So that class was really transformational for me. It just kind of blew my mind like crazy. And I literally changed my degree, and that is the reason I am standing here in front of you today. So just think about that in your own like personal career and academic journey, that you could potentially have a very life-changing experience while you're here doing your degree programs, or even just attending a random talk on a Thursday right before spring break, right? So that's kind of how I got into water, is through this one particular class. And it really opened my eyes to think about, well, we don't often think about water and all these other facets that come into play about how do we get water to that tap that you can turn on? How do we get it to our toilets, into our showers? How does it grow all the food that we need? So I'm more focused on transboundary waters, and I'll talk more on what that entails in a little bit. But first, how many of you have seen headlines like this? I'm gonna make you participate a little bit, with a show of hands. Hopefully everybody, right? So we've got the global water crisis could spiral out of control. The global water crisis fuels more conflicts. Water crisis threatens the world's ability to eat. The water crisis leaves half of world food production at risk in 25 years. And we're treating scarcity as the global crisis that it is. So there's a lot of these big headlines. What do you think are the most common theme? Like, what if you were to drill down the global water crisis into one aspect? Anybody want to take a stab? Probably not enough water, right? So most of these headlines, with the exception of probably these ones here about floods, there's too much water. The global water crisis really centers on not having enough water available. So we're at a lack of water. So this is what we would call water scarcity. So when we think about water scarcity, this is where we don't have enough water to meet our demands. We tend to think of this in a very quantitative manner. So we look at it based off volume. So how much water do we have versus how much water do we need? And we have a couple of different ways that this is measured here in the bullet points. So withdrawals by total supply, or consumption by supply, or renewable resources per capita. And so you can just see on the map an estimate of the average water stress based on these calculations for various subbasins across the world. Why might this be a problem? Is it easier for us to think about the global water crisis as an issue of physical scarcity? Because that's what we're seeing in the media and the discourse. But is that truly what the crisis is? That's kind of the crux of the question. And it's much easier to say, well, we don't have enough water because it didn't rain. We don't have enough water because there wasn't enough snow and we have a low snowpack and it didn't fill the dams, the reservoirs behind the dam. It's much easier for us to associate blame on an uncontrollable thing such as nature rather than how our consumption patterns are changing how much water we're using, how our diet is changing, how much we're managing, how much we're losing. Are we growing things in efficient places that are applicable for that type of crop? So it's much harder to incorporate the reason why we might be in a water crisis is actually due to management or governance. This has become increasingly more challenging as we get to climate change, because now we do have something that's causing changes to our physical system, and it's aggravating a lack of supply or an increased intensity in flow. But it's emphasizing this physical aspect of the narrative, which leads us to be more, to putting more emphasis on the physical nature of water scarcity rather than some of the other solutions. So that's kind of the context that we're in today. So let's think about what climate change actually does to water. I'm setting the scene before we dive into the transboundary water issue part. So when we think about the impacts of climate change on water, the main one is really the intensification of the water cycle. That's where it all really stems. So the current research is saying that it's for every 1 degree C of global warming that we have, it will intensify this pace of the hydrologic cycle by 7%. You can roughly estimate that as places that are dry are going to get 7% drier, places that are wet are going to get 7% wetter. It's just going to be much faster. That's going to change how much snowpack we have, how much glaciers are melting, what our river runoff is, how much groundwater we have. All of these impacts that are directly affecting our water cycle and our resources that are available to us. But that means we'll have a lot of other indirect impacts as a result, such as increasing demands, disruption in food prices, physical impacts that could lead to conflict, which is more where my particular area of focus and research is, this last bullet. And that's all something that we partially can control. How do we create systems, institutions, governance structures so that we can manage these resources more effectively and more sustainably? And that's really the goal of my research portfolio at its basis. So let's dive in then. What are shared waters? So shared waters are waters that are shared. There is some sort of boundary that delineates a system between different groups. That boundary is socially constructed. It could be a political boundary. It could be a cultural boundary. It could be some sort of economic boundary. Most commonly, we use governance scales to break down, but there could be a different way of structuring shared waters. I particularly focus on internationally shared basins, so where our boundaries are the political boundaries. And we define an international river basin as an area that contributes both groundwater and surface water that flows out of a singular outlet, and it crosses or is crossed by an international boundary. We have two defining characteristics. So it has to be perennial. So there isn't a stream that's dry, like you can see on the bottom image. So if there isn't a perennial stream, then we don't consider it from a management perspective. Doesn't mean there isn't a basin there. Just from our standpoint, doesn't fit in our criteria for what we're studying. And then the other is the final outlet to an ocean or inland body. So we're really defining it based off of where that water is going out of. So the top image is actually the mouth of the Columbia River, which is on the border between Oregon and Washington on the Pacific coast. And so all of the water and all of the land that drains out that little area there is the entirety of the Columbia River Basin. We can do the same for transboundary aquifers or groundwater bodies. So an aquifer is going to be a geologic layer that contains water. And then that is, if you're looking kind of at an aerial view of where that geologic layer is, if a political boundary crosses it, that's going to be your transboundary aquifer area. Depending on whose legal system and conventions you're working with, this bottom bullet may or may not change. So in one of the conventions, the 1992 Water Convention, it is agreed that transboundary groundwaters are not hydrologically connected to surface waters. Others, it's included. Those are all legal definitions, which will impact how we're managing it, rather than more of a physical distinction between them. So where are they? This is the map of the transboundary river basins of the world. There's 313 basins globally. They cover just under 50% of the world's land surface, if you exclude Antarctica in that calculation. And almost 50% of the world's population lives in one of these basins, and it contributes 60% of the world's catchment, or the flow comes from a transboundary water source. We break these up into what we call basin country units. So here's the same basin that I was showing the outlet of on the previous slide, the Columbia River Basin. And you can see the area of the Columbia River Basin in Canada versus the Columbia River Basin in the United States. So all of this land, if a little drop of rain falls, it's going to eventually make its way out to the ocean, if it doesn't evaporate or something. But theoretically, it could end up going out the ocean. If we look at our transboundary aquifers, these are a lot harder to map and monitor than surface water basins. Surface water, we can look at the topography, so it's relatively straightforward. For aquifers, it's not quite that simple. It requires a lot more investigation. This is where we're at so far in terms of mapping transboundary aquifers. They have just under 500 is the current count, 496, I think. There's probably more, it's just we don't have as much data and information available to us for these. So, how many of you have seen headlines like this? Water is the new oil. The wars of the next century will be about water. Fierce competition for fresh water may become a source of conflict in wars in the future. Or for years, there were wars fought over oil. In a short time, there will be wars fought over water. We've all probably seen those headlines. Some of you have probably said those statements. So I have a question for you. When was the last war over water? Does anybody know? It was 5,000 years ago, and there's only been one. It was between two Sumerian city-states, Lagash and Umma, in 2550 BC over an irrigation canal. It resulted in what actually was the first precursor to what we think of as the first treaty, which was about water. It was very cool. But there hasn't been a water war since. Why is that the case? There's a couple of challenges with why this narrative is predominant. A, it sells a lot of things with our current news cycle. It's catchy, water war, alliteration, war, water, all sorts of things. But these narratives tend to conflate several items. First, we're conflating where water is involved in a conflict. Is it conflict over water, or is water involved in a conflict that has nothing to do with water? This is what's often commonly conflated, where water is the trigger or the root cause versus conflict that impacts water, where water is a weapon or water is a casualty. So the map is showing you data from the water conflict chronology from the Pacific Institute for just 2 years, 22 years, 2000 to 2022. And it's showing locations of particular conflicts that occurred regarding water. The blue dots are in that first category, a trigger. But then we also have the light blue and the kind of pink orange dots where we're in this second category. So often when people say water war, they might mean, well, somebody bombed this dam. But that was actually a political conflict that impacted water rather than a conflict over water. And so there is this conflation. The other is scale. A large chunk of these dots that are listed here are not between states. They're subnational. And so we tend to also use the word war when we're meaning conflict between non-state actors. And so we're leaning and we're kind of increasing the narrative that there is going to be a water war when actually countries, as we currently define them, have not gone to war over water in 5,000 years. So these are kind of the two main challenges with the narrative when we're talking about water. The other piece is much of the data in the literature that looks at conflict and cooperation over water doesn't actually track cooperation. So we're focusing on the conflict over water, but we've never actually seen, well, is there cooperation over water? We know the first conflict ended in the first treaty, but we're not actually tracking that data. So how can we actually say that there's going to be water conflict or water war when we're not even looking at the other side of the equation? So this is where some of the research that I do and a lot of my colleagues that I work with do kind of tries to fill that gap. So what we started doing is monitoring for conflict and cooperation over water. So now we're just tracking news events that are between different state actors and seeing what's the intensity of that interaction. Is it conflictive or is it cooperative? And trying to map where those are located. So this is showing the color is just the number of events that have occurred. So the darker the color just means more events. Doesn't mean it's conflict or doesn't mean it's cooperative. It could be both. The kind of earthquake looking symbols with the epicenter, those are going to be the number of conflictive events. And so what we end up seeing when we look at all this data, and I show it in a different way, is that there's more cooperation that's occurring over transboundary waters where water is in that root cause or trigger. So that top category from the other slide. There's more cooperation that's happening over transboundary water. So this is the same data that was shown on the map, but just in a bar chart form. And it's collected from 1948 to 2008, and we're in the process of doing an update to this data collection to bring it to the present. And you can see more cooperation. Most of it's lower levels of cooperation, but even when we're looking at conflict, here's our war category, 0 wars. And we've got really low levels of conflict if there is conflict. So verbal disagreements would be here, a written disagreement would be here. So quite low in terms of intensity. And what this study really found is that the likelihood and intensity of dispute rises as the rate of change within a basin exceeds the institutional capacity to absorb that change. Now, what does that mean? It's a complicated sentence. But ultimately, it means as long as we have institutional capacity in place, that's going to provide a resilience mechanism for if a system has a shock to it, it will then be able to handle and not result in conflict. And when I mean institutional capacity, what I'm saying is the treaties, river basin organizations, and even just the positive cooperative relationships between states would count as institutional capacity. So the more cooperation you have, the more institutions you have in place, the more likely you are to not have conflict if something arises that has the potential to trigger conflict. Other things that can support are more at the global scale, where we're looking at international water law or framework conventions, and that can help states provide guidance on what that treaty might look like, or to provide support, for example, if a conflict does arise. So it's giving other mechanisms and avenues for cooperation so that there isn't a need to resort to violent conflict, or just conflict in general, not just violent conflict. What about the subnational? We're focusing on the transboundary, but I just want to bring up the subnational on a little side tangent. And this is where we don't have quite as much information. So it's much harder to collect conflict and cooperation events at the subnational scale. The minimal amount that has been done so far shows a similar pattern. And so you can see that in the bar chart on the right. And this is just data for a handful of countries in the MENA region from 97 to 2009. And they used a slightly different scale, but you'll still notice that the trend is the same. More cooperation than there is conflict. What we're not really sure about is if that holds true everywhere and in what context that holds true. And so some emerging data is showing that there probably is a higher proportion of conflict over water at the subnational scale than there is at the transboundary scale. Weather patterns in particular have been shown to have a causal impact on creating new conflicts regarding civil unrest. So it's less that the conflict is about water, but water might often be a trigger of an underlying political or kind of social unrest that's already present. And so it's more of a confounding variable. Globally, what we are seeing, though, in both the subnational data and the transboundary data is that conflict levels have been increasing. Cooperation still outweighs conflict, but we are starting to see, at least anecdotally in the data that's emerging, that there is starting to be more conflict than there has been, at least since we started collecting data in the 1950s, 40s. So it's much more complicated. We can have water as a conflict trigger, but it's rarely the case that it's the sole factor. So we need to be a little bit more creative and nuanced in our understanding. And that's where some of our research will come in. So what about climate? How does climate change layer onto this context when we're looking at these basins? And so the dominant assumption that you'll see is that climate change will lead to conflict. It's a bit more nuanced than the water wars theory and thesis that was coming out in the 90s, early 2000s, when that was particularly prominent. But we are starting to see similar language recurring now around climate change. What studies have started to see, however, is that just like the water wars thesis, it's also taking a pretty environmentally deterministic approach to it, and that climate change as the sole driver of conflict is actually pretty unlikely. So you can see here on this chart, they're looking at the likelihood of influential factors towards, this is for particularly violent or armed conflict. So they're not looking at lower levels of conflict. And what we see is that climate change variability is actually pretty non-influential regarding what's causing it. But there's a high degree of uncertainty about the effect that it has. So it's going to be a confounding factor. It will probably increase the likelihood of conflict in certain places that already have the preconditions or other triggers and drivers. So it could lead to more conflict as a threat multiplier, which would be the security language. But there's a lot we don't know. We need to further understand. So what do we do about conflict when it does occur? Because that's the other half of my research. The first half is looking at the measuring, what's happening, what's happening out there in terms of conflict and cooperation and monitoring that. And the other half is getting at, well, what do we do? How do we cooperate? So if we think about the scale of cooperation, we generally go from a dispute all the way to full cooperation or integration across a basin. And we tend to think of it as this kind of linear continuum of cooperation. Sometimes that's realistic, sometimes it's not. So how we can better define cooperation is really helpful for targeting policies and creating situations that actually improve cooperation. So we can define transboundary water cooperation as the interactions between actors over shared waters that result in establishing mutually beneficial outcomes through decision-making with formal and informal legal and institutional mechanisms. And the more important part is the second piece, which is there's different types of cooperations or frames of cooperation. So you can think of a frame as a window frame, and you're looking into a room, and each window gives you a different perspective of that room, but all of which together make up the room. So if you took the roof off or the ceiling out and you look down, you could see the entirety of the definition of cooperation, or you can look through each window on the wall and you'll understand a different perspective of how people are approaching cooperation. Whether it's from a legal sense, so putting treaties, laws in place, regulations. Do we have some sort of institution like a basin management plan or basin organization that puts together a basin management plan? And then the two that are often left out, at least at the transboundary, are the relational and the outcome components. So do you have trust? Is there transparency? Is there good communication practices? And then did you do what you said you were going to do? That's kind of the outcome piece. Surprisingly, that's also harder to find when you start looking through the literature. Here's just some examples of what that might look like. And all of these are really heavily going to vary between scale and context. But it's important to note because we often just assume blanket cooperation good, conflict bad, right? That's not the case. Conflict can be good, cooperation can be bad. Cooperation can construct things, but it can also maintain the status quo. It can maintain inequitable relationships between states. Just because you're cooperating doesn't mean you're cooperating for a good reason. So that's the other piece of the definition of transboundary water cooperation, is that you're working towards mutual benefits and you're trying to achieve cooperation for the purposes of equitable and sustainable management of the water resources. This gets at the same idea, which is a framework that a few colleagues have put together on what's called the twins, and it's essentially identifying that a particular event can be both cooperative and conflictive at the same time, and these don't have to exist in isolation. They can exist at the same time in the same space. So you can create a common goal and have this kind of cooperative action that you take between your two different states, but you're doing that maybe through a military or security lens, and so you have a negative conflict, but you also are still cooperating. There might be a lack of trust. And so all of these can take place at the same time. It's not quite as simple conflict cooperation. But why do we want people to cooperate? And hopefully to cooperate in a way that's beneficial. So we have a framework for looking at the idea of what we call mutual benefits. So the result of that cooperative process benefits all the parties that are involved in that cooperation. And there's different types of cooperation depending on kind of how far you move out from the water. So you can benefit the river. So you're improving water quality, you're improving the amount of water that's in the river. You could get benefits from the river. So we can derive navigational access. We can get hydropower production, a cool place to kayak on a hot summer day. All of those things are benefits we get from the river. We can also get benefits because of the river. So because we have better navigational access, we have reduced prices for goods that we can ship. If we have hydropower, we're reducing our carbon emissions and we're having more green energy. Then we have beyond the river. So creating regional infrastructure, increasing political relationships, creating open markets for trade. All of these can then ideally result as you build that cooperative process. So how do you actually get to that cooperation? So we've got hydropolitical resilience and vulnerability. So we want to increase our resilience by increasing our institutional capacity, and we will decrease our vulnerability by reducing our risk. So some things that will increase our resilience: building agreements, implementing the agreements, which is often part of the challenge, creating river basin organizations, having positive relationships, higher levels of economic development generally also influence the resilience, higher technological capacity, more human capacity. What increases vulnerability? More rapid environmental change. This is where the climate change piece comes in. So as climate change is speeding up that hydrologic cycle, like I said on the, at the very beginning, that's increasing the pace that the environment's going to change. Now we have more abrupt physical impacts to our systems, which will increase our vulnerability or decrease our resilience. Rapid population growth, same thing. Rapid population growth is the key point rather than more of a slow population growth. It's not the size, but the pace. Asymmetric economic growth between different parties will also decrease the resilience. Lack of institutional capacity, and then if you're in a conflict, much more likely you're going to continue being in conflict than you are going to cooperate. So ultimately, our goal is to move from an area where there's high political risk, high economic cost, towards areas with high political opportunity and high economic benefit. So how can we create policies and situations that encourage states to perceive cooperating over water in that manner so they can gain the mutual benefits that are available to them by cooperation. One of these tools is what we call water diplomacy. So water diplomacy essentially is diplomacy over water, where state actors or facilitators are working within that space to develop foreign policy, to develop these agreements, to increase the communication, to increase the transparency, and to build these relationships between different state actors. And ideally, essentially building this toolbox that allows for regular conflict management on a day-to-day level. So in an organization that's managing our shared river basin, there might be a small disagreement, but if you're friends with the guy in your office in the respective country, I've talked to water managers that have literally had this happen. He's like, I just call up my co-part in the Mexican office of the Bureau or the International Water Commission that's shared between the US and Mexico. And we go to our kids' like birthday parties and I just ask him this question. Versus if there wasn't that trusting relationship between those individuals, that could potentially escalate into a much higher potential for conflict. So these are all really important soft skills, we might call them, that are actually really vital at protecting the environment and increasing sustainability. The last piece is doing what they need to do. And so this is from my own work where I'm looking at effectiveness of cooperation. So there's a lot on the slide, but ultimately we're looking back at the 4 frames of cooperation. And I want to point out that the outcome bubble is larger and bluer and bigger. And that's because we tend not to measure the outcomes. They're hard to measure. And so if things aren't being achieved as a result of all the time and investment and trust that's placed in a process, and you can actually attribute that to that process, you're going to be less likely to continue to invest in that. So if we're able to actually achieve the results that are set out by these cooperative processes, to measure them and to track them, we're more likely to be able to maintain those cooperative processes. And a lot of that has to do with the relational element, which is also kind of heavily under attributed in the literature. So with that, I will wrap up here. Happy to answer any questions. But yeah, thank you all for coming.
Thank you very much. That was a really wonderful presentation. And while people get their thoughts together, I have some questions. I'll start with one. Is there an example of 2 countries that you admire because of their great approach to cooperation about a shared body of water?
I'm laughing because it's a funny question of what happened recently. So historically, the US and Canada on the Columbia River Basin have been held up as a model for transboundary cooperation. So when a lot of textbooks talk about mutual benefits, they use the Columbia River Treaty as an example. The US essentially, so the treaty was designed in 1964. It has expired. We'll get to the rest later. But ultimately, there's flood control mechanisms and power mechanisms. So the US is downstream, and there used to be significant floods that impacted a lot of the major cities along the Columbia and the US side of the border. So the states, the US and Canada got together and they decided we'll build some dams. The better places for the dams were in the Canadian side of the river. So the US has paid for the production of hydropower at those dams as well as purchased them. And then they receive flood control benefits downstream on the US side of the basin. So it's where we see this example of mutual benefit. So the Canadian side gets hydropower production, plus they get an economic incentive from the US purchasing power. The US gets clean power at an agreed upon rate, and they get flood control. So that's what we mean when we say mutual benefits. I would hesitate to call what's happening currently because the current administration just halted the renegotiation process that's been ongoing for the treaty. So an interim agreement will expire in 2027. That's been signed, so we'll see there is an agreement in principle, but nothing's been signed.
Interesting. While I walk to Ninian, is there any example where the conflict is between two countries where the more affluent country has the best access to the water than the other country, and what kind of leverage the less affluent country has to work on? And I'm thinking maybe between Mexico and the US, how do they deal with that?
Yeah, I mean, the Mexico and the US is a great example where for the most part, the US is upstream. There's a couple tributaries of the Rio Grande that flow from Mexico into the US. But predominantly between the Rio Grande, Rio Bravo, and the Colorado and the Tijuana rivers, the US is the predominant upstream state. So historically, in the past, I would say it didn't go well. The partition and the allocation of the water within the Colorado River Basin was done within the United States in the 1920s. And they essentially just allocated all the water. There was a little clause, oh, we'll leave some for Mexico. But it was really just done domestically within the United States. And it wasn't until the 1940s that US and Mexico then signed a treaty on the three basins that are shared on the border, the Rio Grande, Rio Bravo, and the Colorado and the Tijuana. And so then they'd already allocated the amount of water within the US, so the remainder was what was left for Mexico. So in the negotiations in the 1940s, even at that point in time, the US was more of a stronger economic power. And so that economic and power differential definitely enabled the US to maintain the status quo with the historical allocations that were set up in the 20s, with Mexico just receiving the remainder. So it's shifting, I would say, slightly now.
Thank you so much. This was such a marvelous talk. My question, looking at the map, going back to the map of sort of conflicts over water and thinking about, you mentioned subnational actors, but I find myself thinking, would the map look really different if we added in domestic sovereign nations, not only in the United States? I think of examples of conflicts over water between domestic sovereign nations in countries in South America, in First Nations Canada.
Yeah.
Would this look very different? And if so, how would that change this conversation?
Great question. I would imagine it would look quite different and there'd be a lot more conflict because the power differentials are even greater. We haven't collected that kind of data. And the comparison from country to country, I think, would be really challenging just because of the way those sovereign groups are recognized by each state. It's just how the US treats Native American tribes versus how Canada treats First Nations versus tribes within the Amazon in Brazil. So it'd be hard to potentially map to see the level of conflict and cooperation, and you'd have to look at the different legal systems with how sovereignty is addressed with them. But it would be really interesting to do so. But I would imagine it would increase the conflict drastically.
Hi, thank you. This is really educational. It's useful to kind of get this perspective on like, oh, it's not this dire kind of everyone's going to be killing each other for water kind of story that you see in the press. But I was also thinking when you were showing those histograms, like, I think if you think about most issues, probably people are more cooperative than conflictive in general. Like, and so I was curious if you could talk about some other examples of kind of international spaces for negotiation and diplomacy and conflict, like kind of like how water falls against some of those other examples.
Great question. It depends. Literally was the chapter title of my dissertation, so it's my fallback statement, but it works. Water's really different than, I'm going to stick with the environment because that's more what I know than non-environmental issues, and we're all here for an environmental lecture series, so maybe that's okay. Water's different than a lot of other environmental resources that are dealt with globally because it is more of a transboundary resource than a global commons resource. So if we think about climate, for example, or the oceans with the high seas and UNCLOS, the Law of the Sea Treaty, a lot of the resources that are more what we'd consider to be global commons have stronger, at the international scale, tend to have stronger global consensus and negotiations. So we can those are the treaties you're most familiar with. So the UNFCCC, the Paris Agreement, UNCLOS, the Law of the Sea Convention, or the Montreal Protocol, or the Antarctica Treaty, or the Outer Space Treaty. When we get into the resources that more affect state sovereignty, it becomes a lot more challenging. So water is one of them. Forests are another one where we don't have an international binding agreement. There's some work that's been done on like land use change and desertification. There is a convention, but I wouldn't say it's as strong as some of the other conventions that we would consider to be on global commons. And so the potential threat to state sovereignty for these resources makes it more challenging than the ones that are truly global commons. And so where you can have, there's less of a direct decline or reduction of state sovereignty. At the state to state level, there's actually a lot of examples. And so states are more likely to enter into bilateral or maybe mini multilateral, where it's just a handful of states that share the same resource, and that will be more common. So at the international scale, they'll give up their sovereignty, but they recognize that cooperation needs to happen, so it might be more likely to occur at a little bit of a smaller basin level scale. I think that mostly answers your question.
Ellen online asks, can you walk us through the example of cooperation along the Nile with Ethiopia, Egypt, Sudan, and others in view of the Millennium Dam?
Yes, I can do that. But I'm going to start way earlier in the 20s. Because that's a lot of it where it stems from, is the colonial history of Africa. So in the 1920s, I think it's either 23 or 29, I'm getting my year exactly mixed up. Egypt and Great Britain signed a treaty on behalf of themselves that Egypt would get 80% of the flow of the Nile, and the rest would be for the upstream states. This was reconfirmed after Egypt's independence when they signed a treaty in the 1950s between Egypt and Sudan, where it retained those same historical water allocations. Egypt gets 80%, Sudan gets the rest, and there was no acknowledgement or reference to the other upstream states in those particular agreements. So that's the scene that we're in. So we have a historical legal precedent that Egypt uses 80% of the water. So think about you're a farmer in the Delta and in the Nile. That's part of your lifeblood, your identity. Using that water, increasing the agricultural production is vital, it's important. And so you see a lot of that same rhetoric within the politicians as the lead up to the construction and the filling of the GERD, the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. So as the states in the Nile has started to increase in the upstream part of the basin and get independence and then increase the cooperation that was going to happen, there began to get the tension because the upstream states wanted to develop their own water resources, but historically, according to these legal precedents, Egypt has the bulk of the supply. So how do you deal with that? Who deserves, do you keep the historical right? Do you keep the right to develop in the future? And so that ends up being kind of the crux of the conflict. So Ethiopia decides to construct their own dam on the Blue Nile, as that's going to increase electrification, they'll have irrigation. It's a huge benefit to the country. But you can see the threat that Egypt might feel as a result. And so that's where we get the conflict from. So a lot of it is due to the historical colonial legacy within the continent of Africa, and what those original treaties established. So there is legal precedent, if you will, but then it's also not taking into account the inequities as a result of that. And so how do we deal with that moving forward? So the dam's completely filled now. So they still need to make some sort of agreement on the operation of the dam, but the bulk of the concern, which would be for filling the dam, because you need to slow the water flow even more in order to increase the level of the dam. And that would be the most concern for cutting off water flow to Egypt. And since that's been completed, I would argue that the immediate threat of potential conflict has lessened as a result.
Thank you so much. This is really an enjoyable talk. I did want to, my question kind of goes back to the previous question you answered a little bit about global commons. And in particular, what I'm wondering is the extent to which you're seeing conflict, international conflict, cooperation, and or research being conducted into interventions in the water cycle that are not happening with terrestrial water. So we're thinking about, for example, cloud seeding or something like that, large cloud seeding operations. To what extent are there sort of conflicts and cooperation in that space?
Not a lot. Most are happening on a really small scale. And so the transboundary impacts are either minimal or not really, you can't really determine the causality related to them from what I've read. This isn't my exact area, so there could be more that I'm not familiar with. So I'm going to put the little caveat on that. But from what I've seen, there has been some comments where a state's done some cloud seeding and then there's been a decline in rainfall the next year. And they're like, well, that was because so-and-so was doing cloud seeding. I can't remember the exact example. I believe it was in the Middle East somewhere. So there's been some anecdotal conflict, very, very low grade conflict. But again, they can't actually say that that's what caused the decline in rainfall. There's been a lot more work more recently, though, on how do we govern that. So there's a new body of work within the Earth systems governance literature, in particular, looking at how do you manage, is transboundary water atmospheric water? And if water flows in the atmosphere, does that make it transboundary? Would that be more of a global commons? And so people are starting to explore that from a legal angle, but it's really an emerging area.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. It was so interesting. I was just wondering, like, sort of related to water allocation, what role does like pollution allocation and water quality play in these like international transboundary negotiations?
Good question. All good questions. A lot, and now it's having a lot more of a role. So historically, our database of treaties starts from the mid to late 1800s. And historically, treaties originally were more on navigation, borders, and then allocation, so quantity related issues. It's only been kind of in the last 30 or 40 years that the water quality treaties have increased. And that kind of makes sense if you think we've seen a greater spike in human population growth, the agricultural revolution, where we've been using more fertilizers and chemicals, there's more contaminants, industry's grown. So you can see somewhat of a similar trend. And so it's definitely more common in treaties currently to deal with how do you deal with pollution? Because pollution will just move across the border. And so all that negative externalities aren't just falling on the downstream state. It's increasing, more work still needs to be done.
Isabel online asks, speaking of agriculture, considering the vast majority of water use is allocated for it, how do you see it playing into either more or less cooperation or conflict in the next 10, 20 years?
Agriculture is big. So that's a lot of the water quantity allocations that have been done in the past have been regarding agriculture, because agriculture, between 70–80% of the water that's consumed globally goes towards agricultural production. So it's a really important component. At the interstate level, they're generally working a bit larger. So there might be some specific agreements that are dealing with a specific irrigation diversion or a very large scale irrigation project, but a lot of that's going to be a bit more domestic. But they do play a role in kind of how the state perceives its allocation and what it's using that particular water for. And so you can see various conflicts emerging. For example, to come back to the US-Mexico, in the California-Mexico border, we have an area where the water will flow from California down, and these canals are heavily polluted. They've been lining the canals, which has reduced the amount of groundwater that's infiltrating, which the groundwater then flows. And so the farmers in the northern part of Mexico have actually been reduced their groundwater tables have declined as a result of the US increasing its efficiency by lining the canals and reducing the amount of groundwater that infiltrates. So the US is able to consume more, and the impact, it wasn't intentional, really impacted the farmers and the agriculture in that part of Mexico. And so that's led to a lot of political and social unrest in those areas that has influenced the negotiations with US and Mexico on their drought contingency plans. So there's a lot of examples of that. It just requires multiple steps in the way in a lot of cases.
All right, we should probably leave it at that, but thank you so much. Let's thank Dr. McCracken one more time.